We all know the Titanic. We've heard stories of its interior beauty, the sumptuous furnishings and wood-panelled spaces inspired by the finest mansions and country estates in Europe. For the travelling Edwardian public, she was the latest thing in luxury at sea, designed to trick passengers into thinking they weren't on a ship at all, but maybe staying in a fine hotel. But beneath all the grandeur and the luxury, there was a secret world. If you were to strip away all the beautiful fittings and furnishings, you'd find cold, hard steel, and powering it all was the beating heart of a mechanical marvel. "159 red-hot furnaces in 29 monstrous boilers were hand-fed 600 tons of coal per day by 176 men around the clock. Scalding hot steam vented through at extreme pressure to drive the colossal pistons of the 3-story tall engines. Whatever was left over was captured by an enormous turbine rotor. The result was a whopping 46,000 horsepower, enough to drive the ship through the mighty North Atlantic in just a few days." Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. A few weeks ago we explored Titanic's engines and machinery in brief, but today I'd like to present a new and improved guide to how this incredible piece of technology worked. This is the story of the men and the machines that powered one of history's greatest ships. This is the complete guide to Titanic's engines. Harland & Wolff Shipyard, Belfast, Ireland, 1910. If you were to walk around the various sheds and workshops, you'd have seen fascinating things. All manner of objects used to build enormous passenger ships. Piles and piles of brass portholes, tall ventilators, paint workshops with huge drums of all colours. But in one workshop in particular, you'd have found something truly remarkable. The main engines of a Titan. These are the reciprocating engines of Titanic before they were installed in the ship. Here, the workmen of Harland & Wolff are just test-fitting the assembly. The engines were actually installed in pieces with the help of a massive floating crane. When we think of Titanic's power plant, these are what probably springs first and foremost to mind. They are towering and incredibly impressive, but they are just one part of a much larger system which, when combined, was able to drive Titanic through the mighty Atlantic Ocean at speed. Today, we'll break down this system and learn how Titanic was powered. We'll look at the boilers where steam was generated. We'll follow the steam on its path, first through the main engines, then into the central turbine, and finally the condensers. And then we'll look at how the sheer power of this whole assembly resulted in turning the massive manganese bronze propellers. We're going to look at some pretty incredible machinery and learn how it all worked. But interestingly, we need to start our journey not with a machine, but with a man. This is Frederick Barrett, then 29, from Southampton, England, and aboard Titanic, he had a special job. Barrett was a fireman, one of nearly 180 men whose job it was to feed Titanic her fuel, and this was no easy job. The firemen were a special bunch, nicknamed the Black Gang because they would return from their shifts coated in thick coal dust. Their job was so demanding and filthy they had to be kept separated from the majority of the rest of the ship's crew forward in the very bow of the ship in big dormitories. To get to work, they would trudge down a winding, long staircase into the very bowels of the ship. Shuffling through a narrow tunnel, they would make their way into their office. This was one of the cavernous boiler rooms. Titanic had 6 of these massive compartments at the very bottom of the ship, running for about 320 feet of the ship's entire length. Their sides were the ship's hull itself, unshielded from the ocean, and about 30 feet or 9 meters below the surface. Up above, narrow catwalks branched out and provided emergency escape pathways up top, but the main event of these rooms were the boilers. Titanic had 29 of these beasts, and this is where the ship's propulsion really began. Titanic was wide enough that in most of the rooms, 5 boilers could be arranged and seated side by side, but towards the bow, as the hull narrowed, The final boiler room could only fit 4. The boiler rooms were numbered 1 through 6, and Boiler Room 1's boilers were different from all the rest. They were only single-ended, meaning they only had 3 furnaces each on one side. The main boilers throughout the other rooms were double-ended with 6 red-hot furnaces, each hungry for tons and tons of coal. The main boilers were 15 feet or 4.5 meters tall, and 20 feet or 6 meters long, massive things that existed purely to burn coal and boil water. The boilers featured corrugated furnace tubes where the coal would be loaded and burned. Running the length of the boilers inside were fire tubes, pipes where the hot gases and exhaust from the furnace would be drawn through. 3/4 of the inside of the boiler was filled with water, and it would be boiled off into Titanic's very lifeblood, its steam. But not just any water could be used. Any impurities could gunk up the machinery and have terrifying consequences. A boiler or steam pipes lined with leftover residue could eventually burst in a scalding explosion. A complex system designed to recirculate water throughout the ship and its engines was employed to keep things as pure as possible. It all started down in the very bottom of the ship. The ship's double bottom was a special safety feature that added a second inner skin to the bottom of the ship. It stood about 5 feet above the keel. Now this inadvertently created a huge amount of enclosed space which designers could use for water storage. The inner spaces of the double bottom were sealed off and segmented into 44 tanks which could hold fresh or salt water for different purposes. Using suctions and an array of pumps, up to 5,754 tons of seawater could be drawn in for ballast to help balance out the ship's trim as it sat in the water. An imbalance could be bad news. Here's a picture of Olympic with a very noticeable lean to one side. Counter-flooding the ballast tanks could balance this out and return the ship to an even trim. Aside from these saltwater tanks, there were also 7 freshwater tanks which could hold just under 1,000 tons of water, much of it actually used for drinking water. But Titanic's boilers needed to consume a monumental amount of water to keep generating all that steam for the engines, but salt water couldn't be used. Boiling salt water in huge volumes would create a massive amount of leftover salt, which would block the lines and be catastrophic to the whole system. Commenter Not9873 pointed out that a buildup of any kind of scaling, that is minerals in the water that adhere to surfaces over time, can create additional insulation inside the boiler and lead to a buildup of temperature. Now this can lead to a tube or a pipe burning through, sending all that hot gas and fumes back into the furnace and then venting out under extreme pressure through the boiler and into the crew spaces, and anyone standing around would be horribly scalded. Titanic's boilers used what was called feed water, that is fresh water provided at the start of a voyage by tender. The feed system was ingenious. It was a simple closed loop. The fresh feed water would be boiled in the boilers, turned into steam, and then sent through to the main engines, exhausted out, sent through the turbine, cooled, and then condensed back into water by the condensers, circulated through filters, back into the boilers to go around again. But over time, as the engines ran for days on end, there would be a natural amount of evaporation or contamination from things like grease or lubricants. The water would need to be topped up, and for this, Titanic's boilers could use seawater to create boiler feed water. It just had to have all of the salt taken out of it first. To do this, Titanic used machines called evaporators to take seawater drawn into the ship and essentially boil the salt right out of it. The evaporators were a kind of heat exchanger. Like the ship's main boilers, they too used a system of tubes, but these tubes were fed by the ship's hot steam. Seawater would come into contact with these extremely hot tubes and boil off into steam, leaving salt deposits behind. And the steam was then cooled, and as it did so, it turned into distilled water. While much of the feed water was condensed and turned into distilled water, a lot more of it was run through the evaporators to remove the excess salt, and then it was dumped overboard. The evaporators could make up to 60 tons of distilled water every day. The distilled water created by the evaporators wasn't used for passenger drinking water. It could, in emergencies, be aerated and circulated as drinking water, but it was mainly used to feed water into the boiler system. Passenger drinking water was stored down in the tanks of the double bottom. It would be pumped up to the boat deck, where a holding tank in the engine room ventilated deckhouse could rely on gravity and pressure in the water pipes that ran up Titanic's funnels to run directly to the taps throughout the ship. 3/4 of the boiler was constantly filled with boiler feed water, but the top quarter was left empty because this is where the steam would begin to accumulate. As the fire tubes began to heat up, as the hot gases from the furnace were drawn through them, they would heat the water around them until they could turn the water instantly to steam. In fact, so much of the stuff would be generated that the boilers would eventually be under 215 pounds per square inch, or about 15 bar of pressure. All up, the 159 furnaces boasted 144,000 square feet of heating area, a monumental surface area, and every bit of it was needed to feed the hungry, powerful engines. All good fires need air to burn efficiently, and Titanic's boiler furnaces were no different. But being positioned at the very bottom of the ship, this provided a unique challenge for the builders. Some designers opted to use a system called forced draft, where fans would suck air from above directly into the boiler furnaces, but this meant the boiler room itself would go largely unventilated, creating hellish conditions for the workers. Titanic used a different system, a natural draft. 12 huge Scirocco ventilator fans sucked air from the ship's topside deep down into the boiler rooms themselves. It cooled the air somewhat, provided fresh air as well, but then it also fed the boilers. The pressure differences caused by the burning fires and the Titanic's huge funnels up above would force oxygen into the boilers through vents, creating a constant flow of air into the ship's fires. Like the legs of a giant spider, the funnel uptakes branched out and met each boiler, carrying all the excess smoke and dust way up 175 feet or 53 meters up and out the top of the 3 functioning funnels. This is one of the reasons why ships' funnels were so tall at the time. It wasn't just to clear soot and ash away from the ship. A taller funnel would create a greater draft, and the furnaces would burn better. It's why Cunard ships of the time had those massive smokestacks. It wasn't just for show. In Titanic's boiler rooms, fireman Frederick Barrett and his colleagues would work around the clock in shifts. In fact, their work was so hard that they would work 4 hours on and then have 8 hours off duty. And that's for good reason, because in the stokehold, the working spaces of the boiler rooms could reach 49 degrees Celsius or 120 Fahrenheit. All that despite the air being sucked in by those big Scirocco fans. The firemen would shovel coal into the boilers to keep the furnaces burning bright and the steam pressure at the desired level. And this was communicated from the bridge via illuminated panels, which would order the boilers to stop or provide pressure enough for slow, half, or full speed. At full speed, Titanic would burn through up to 600 tons of coal per day. That's the weight of 2 London buses worth of coal per hour, and all of it was shoveled into the furnaces by hand. There was so much of the stuff being consumed that as the coal levels dropped, it was the jobs of trimmers to make sure that the ship wouldn't be off balance as the coal bunkers, or the storage, were depleted. So with Barrett and his fellow firemen working in the boiler rooms ensuring constant pressure and a consistent burn, the steam would be vented under pressure into the engines. It was fed into 2 main steam pipes of heavy rolled steel. The pipes ran from the boilers back along the ship's length towards the engine room compartment. They passed through watertight bulkheads, coal bunkers and boiler rooms until finally they met the engine room. And this is where the steam that they carried was put to its first good use. The main engine room was a cavernous space almost 70 feet or 21 meters long, occupying the entirety of a watertight compartment and the entire width of the ship. Early on, when Titanic had been newly launched and the room was empty, the room would have seemed like the inside of a massive steel cathedral. It soared all the way up to D-deck, but once the engines and auxiliary machines had been installed, the space would have been entirely occupied by their massive bulk. The engineers basically lived and worked almost inside their engines, using catwalks and ladders to nimbly maneuver between the massive pistons and bed plates and keep the engines turning efficiently. Titanic actually made use of a weird, hybrid form of propulsion. Shipbuilders of the time had 2 main engine types to choose from. The newer turbines, which were extremely powerful, but they were somewhat expensive to run. Early Parsons turbines weren't geared, so they consumed a massive amount of fuel. Not only that, but being the newer technology, many shipbuilders didn't trust them yet. By contrast, builders could employ the older triple or quadruple expansion steam engines. These were cheaper, reliable, and more economic, but they were slower and would mean that your ship was not liable to win out the coveted blue ribbon, which was the speed record. Harland and Wolff, Titanic's builders, and the White Star Line, her owners, weren't going for a speed record with the ship or her sister Olympic, but they were also building the largest passenger ships yet built. A pair of triple expansion steam engines alone just wouldn't cut it. Olympic and Titanic would probably only be able to lumber along at 17 or 18 knots top speed. No, a third engine would be needed. A powerful one. And for this, Harland and Wolff chose to employ the sheer brute force of a turbine engine. In this way, the ship would have a kind of hybrid propulsion, squeezing every bit of power that they could out of the steam before it was finished with. But first, it had to go through the ship's twin main reciprocating engines, and these things were truly incredible. The triple expansion steam engine was a monument of Victorian engineering. They'd first appeared in the second half of the 1800s, and they revolutionised ocean-going travel. Titanic's engines were some of the largest ever constructed. The engines themselves were 3 stories tall. They can be a little bit hard to decipher, so I'm going to show you these plans and then explain just the major components. First of all, the engines were seated on huge, heavy bed plates. The engines had to, of course, be fixed to the ship, but this presented unique challenges. For one, operating at full clip, the engines would be vibrating away, and in the worst Atlantic storms, Titanic would be rocking and rolling side to side by as much as 20 degrees or so. The engines had to stay attached with absolutely no risk of falling over. This was not an easy task when those engines weighed 720 tons each. To this end, the engine bed plates were made extremely heavy duty. They were constructed of 5 enormously thick iron castings bolted together, weighing almost 200 tons alone when assembled. These bed plates are from Titanic's sister ship Britannic, and you can see just how heavily constructed they are. It's testament to the engineering and durability of these castings that even through the violence of Titanic's sinking, when the stern was lifted up to 30 degrees into the air and the entire ship's middle disintegrated, the engines largely remained locked in place and are standing on the wreck today. In a way, the bed plates are still doing their jobs 110 years later. Attached to the bed plates were the 4-cylinder support columns in a kind of inverted Y shape, 21 tons each of cast steel. Atop each of these were the massive engine cylinders, up to 50 tons each. No wonder those support columns had to be so heavy duty. And here the name of the engine type might be a little bit misleading, because although these were triple expansion steam engines, they used 4 cylinders. Like the engine in your car, these cylinders each had a huge piston attached with connecting rods to the crankshaft. Titanic's engines were double-acting. It was a simple arrangement. Turning the engine would operate a slide valve which, as it went up and down, would admit steam under pressure, either at the bottom of the stroke, sending the piston up, or at the top of the stroke, sending the piston back down again. This would happen over and over again, creating an immensely powerful and efficient engine. The engines were called triple expansion steam engines because they would expand the steam 3 different times throughout the 4 cylinders. To run the engines and the turbines, the steam produced by the boilers had to be at a fairly high pressure. On Titanic, it would enter the first cylinder at 210 pounds per square inch. Titanic steam is what we call saturated steam. This was used in machinery throughout the early years of the 20th century. Essentially, it's steam derived from water heated to a specific temperature for a required pressure. In Titanic's case, about 215 pounds per square inch. But saturated steam, like that used on Titanic, contained minute droplets of water. As soon as it goes through the system, it naturally condenses a little bit as the heat is lost, losing steam volume and pressure. For example, Titanic's boilers created steam at 215 pounds per square inch, but it reached the engines at 5 pounds per square inch less. As it dropped in temperature, it would naturally condense and create water droplets. So to deal with this, Titanic's steam lines featured separators, which were designed to catch water droplets and remove them before the steam entered the main engine cylinders. It would come from the big main steam lines from the boilers and enter the high pressure cylinder at about 210 pounds per square inch. It would be exhausted here and then vented into the next cylinder, the intermediate pressure cylinder, designed to operate at 78 pounds per square inch. Again, it would be exhausted down to 24 pounds per square inch in the low pressure cylinders. Counter to what might seem like common sense, the first cylinder forward was actually a low pressure cylinder. This was implemented as a way of balancing the engine and reducing vibration. In this way, the steam was vented through, lifting all 4 pistons, turning the crankshaft, and being exhausted of most of its pressure. The triple expansion engine's secret to success was the fact that it could capture the power of the steam from 210 pounds per square inch gauge all the way down to 24 pounds per square inch gauge before exiting, totally exhausted, at 9 pounds per square inch absolute, which is actually below the pressure of Earth's atmosphere. The engines could be worked up to full speed over the course of about an hour, and to reverse direction they needed their own dedicated Brown's reversing engine to engage the cranks and reverse the rotation on the crankshaft almost immediately. To control the engine's speed, valves could bleed off steam to ensure the right amount of engine revolutions was being met. At full steam ahead, this was about 75 revolutions per minute, but when manoeuvring around port, it would need to be much slower. The engineers could use the bypass valves to bleed off pressure and accurately follow orders from the bridge, which was sent down via telegraphs. All told, the 4 cylinders of the engines could generate 15,000 horsepower as they used the steam at all 3 levels of pressure. Scattered around the engine room were the bits of miscellaneous machinery required to make all of this happen. Feed pumps, air pumps, direct contact heaters. It was a dazzling, cramped space, but to the ship's 60-odd engineers and greasers, it was home. They would have known its baffling layout like the back of their hand. On the 6-day voyage from Southampton to New York, the engines would need to turn well over 500,000 times. And to keep it all working efficiently, engineers worked around the clock and watched the pressure levels and revolutions carefully. The greasers were employed purely to ensure the massive connecting rods and crankshafts were properly oiled and lubricated so they could keep working non-stop for the entire voyage. The steam, once it reached Titanic's engines, would have been hundreds of degrees in temperature, and the engine room would have been extremely hot, were it not for a clever bit of simple engineering. Towering over the engine room was a skylight way up on Titanic's boat deck with covers which could be swung open. Not only did this admit natural light deep down into the engine room's depths, but it made use of a simple principle of thermodynamics. Hot air rises. It meant that without assistance, the heated air generated from the steam in the engines would rise up and out of the skylight. But for now, we need to step outside the confines of the engine room and look further back at the very stern of the ship, because here, either side, were the 2 massive outboard propellers. These beauties combined a steel hub with bronze blades in a massively heavy arrangement. They each weighed about 38 tons. To actually get these monsters to turn and cut through the water at speed, the main engines needed to transmit their power, but they were far away, about 250 feet further forward. To actually connect the engines to the propellers, huge, long propeller shaft assemblies were needed. The propeller shafts were made up of steel cylinders about 30 feet long that tapered gradually away from the engines and out into the outboard propeller wings, where they met and connected to the propellers. These would be constantly revolving, so they were housed in long tunnels where crew would have access for maintenance, the shaft tunnels, and they had forced lubrication systems to ensure there was no friction buildup and the propeller shafts could continue turning non-stop. But there was a huge engineering challenge thanks to the propellers themselves. The ship's thrust forward or backward was transmitted along the propeller shaft from the propellers, but the resulting force would be fatal to the engines. They weren't designed to absorb that massive force or the resulting vibration. Instead, special devices had to be built that would take all that power from the propellers and transfer it away from the engines and into the very hull of Titanic itself. These were the thrust blocks, and their function was simple in concept. The propeller shaft exiting the engine was connected directly to the thrust block, a heavy cast iron bed plate mounted firmly to the ship's bottom. A series of 14 collars mounted directly to the shaft here would sit inside a dedicated thrust bearing or shoe. In this way, the thrust coming back from the propellers would be captured by the thrust block and then distributed back into the hull, instead of heading right back into the engines and taking them apart. The engines would turn the crankshafts, and the crankshafts would spin the entire propeller shaft assembly, the thrust shaft and the thrust blocks, then the intermediate and tail shaft assembly, and then finally the propellers. Titanic would be moving ahead. So we followed the steam through the main engines and see how this turned the big propellers. But Titanic's designers had introduced one final ingenious use for the steam before it was all used up. Remember when I mentioned that Titanic employed a weird kind of hybrid propulsion? Well, it was here that the steam was used one last time. Exiting the main engines at 9 pounds per square inch, below Earth's atmospheric pressure, it would be vented into Titanic's secret weapon, the low-pressure turbine. Aft of, or behind, the main engine room was the turbine room, a continuation of the engine room space, but separated from it by a watertight bulkhead. Here, the compartment was completely taken up by the enormous turbine, the second largest of its kind ever built. In fact, the biggest low-pressure exhaust turbine ever built went to Britannic, which was Titanic's younger sister ship. The turbine assembly was by itself over 410 tons. It was 50 feet long, longer than a modern Greyhound bus. It was relatively simple in its layout. A huge iron casing was cast in 2 halves. For extra strength, it was heavily reinforced with ribbing. To even cast something as large as this, complicated wooden patterns were made to create the molds, and it was all done in-house. Harland & Wolff's shipyard was a wonderland of warehouses and machine shops where almost every part of the hundreds and hundreds of thousands of individual components used to create a big ocean liner were made by specialist craftsmen. It took just as much attention to detail and care to carve the panels for the first-class spacers as it did to cast the monstrous machinery. But even so, some parts were beyond Harland & Wolff's capabilities. They outsourced even bigger castings, like the stem of the ship, which is the very, very front and back, to the Darlington Forge Company, who specialised in that kind of thing. But at Harland & Wolff, they were hard at work, casting the biggest ever low-pressure exhaust turbine casing. And inside the casing sat a rotor, itself over 100 tons, and spun on a monstrous lathe. The lathe cut grooves into the rotor's body, where thousands and thousands of blades could be fitted. The entire assembly was test-fitted, and then, after Titanic had been launched, it was lowered into the ship from the giant floating crane. In fact, all the machinery fittings were installed after launch. These photos are from Britannic's fitting out, and they show just this. Here are the main engine bed plates, and here are the engine support columns. The basic principle of the low-pressure turbine was that as the steam was exhausted down to 9 pounds per square inch by the main engines, it was vented at speed into the turbine, passing through the casing between the rows of blades. This would cause the rotor to spin, and like the main engines, it was connected to its own dedicated shaft and thrust block, with a shaft leading to the third central propeller, which sat perfectly between the 2 wing propellers. The thrust block for the turbine was different to the others because it was part of the turbine casing itself. All up, the turbine could generate 16,000 shaft horsepower. The benefit of having an outer casing in 2 halves like this was that, for maintenance, it could be cracked open and lifted up with chains by an electric motor and a system of pulleys and eyelets on the turbine room's roof. The secret to the turbine's success was that it could operate with steam venting through that was at pressures below Earth's atmosphere. Contemporary graphs and information from the age show that in the triple expansion steam engines of the time, 33% of the power extracted from the steam was done so in conditions below Earth's atmospheric pressure. The turbine, running at a pressure below Earth's atmosphere pressure, would actually assist the main engines. It would draw steam through the main engine cylinder, greatly increasing efficiency and power. The whole engine system was connected. The condensers themselves, at the end of the system, operated in a vacuum, 28 inches of mercury vacuum, created by the cooling of the steam itself. As the steam condenses, both its temperature and volume decrease, which in turn cause the pressure within the condenser to drop. Titanic also employed huge pumps to service the condensers, removing condensate from the steam and maintaining that vacuum. On ships like this, the power of the pumps and the vacuum in the condenser unit is such that running the pumps could turn the engines on vacuum alone. But the central turbine had a couple of quirks. For one thing, it required the main engines to be operating in order to begin capturing the power of the steam as it came through the engines. Crucially though, it couldn't be operated in reverse. No gearing was provided for reversing the thrust, and the rotor's blades couldn't be reversed either. It didn't have a particularly negative impact on Titanic's maneuverability though. There's a bit of a myth that Titanic handled or turned badly, but it's not true. She was a good turner for a ship of her size, but not only that, she was quick. That central turbine was the ace up Titanic's sleeve. It gave her and her sister Olympic a top speed of 23 knots. This was an enormous achievement. Cunard Line's sisters, Lusitania and Mauretania, had been built specifically with speed in mind, and they accomplished this with raw power. 4 hugely powerful turbines outputting nearly 70,000 horsepower. But Olympic and Titanic were 10,000 tons larger than the Cunard ships, but they burned 73% less coal, and were, after all that, only 2 or 3 knots slower. Lusitania burned 1,000 tons of coal per day, at least, but Titanic, the much larger ship, only burned 600. You can see just how clever the hybrid propulsion engine system was that Harland & Wolff had chose to use on Olympic and Titanic. It was simply engineering genius. There was another clever use of the ship's architecture to keep temperatures comfortable for the engineering staff. We saw how Titanic's main engine room had a large skylight to help hot air rise up and out of the ship. Well, so did the turbine room, and not just any skylight. Titanic's 4th funnel sat directly on top of the turbine room. It didn't vent smoke out of any of the boilers, but it did provide a huge, towering shaft for the hot air in the turbine room to escape. Not only that, but it was crisscrossed inside with access ladders so that engineers on break could climb all the way up and get a breather at the very top of the ship's 4th funnel. Of course, the end result was that all that power was provided to the propellers. The massive outboard props 23 feet across, and the smaller central propeller driven by the turbine about 17 feet across. But here there was an opportunity for Harland & Wolff to squeeze yet more power out of their design. The sheer strength of a ship's engines is useless if paired with a poor propeller design, and back then, in an era without advanced computer modelling and simulations, the only way to properly test was to put new designs into service and await reports from the ship's engineers. For designers, it was all a battle between power and efficiency versus vibration. The number of the propeller blades on the propeller, their angles, their size, their shape, it all impacted how Titanic and ships like her would operate, and until recently, it wasn't known that Titanic was actually experimenting with a different kind of propeller. See, no photos of Titanic's propellers exist. This very famous shot is of Olympic in 1911, and this one, often billed as Titanic in books, is again Olympic but in the 1920s. We know from these photos and engineering records that Olympic, the first of the trio, was fitted with a 4-bladed central propeller. But a recent examination of documents shows that Titanic was likely fitted instead with a 3-bladed one. This was classic Harland & Wolff, experimenting with what would create the most efficient setup while dampening the most vibration. Lusitania and Mauretania and dozens of other ships had their propellers changed quite a few times throughout their careers as new arrangements were tested. Of course, the results of Titanic's testing with a 3-bladed propeller were lost when the ship sank, but after she did, Olympic was also fitted with a 3-bladed setup, and those results were disappointing. She went back to a 4-bladed central propeller shortly after, and that was the end of that. With the boilers roaring red-hot with flame, the reciprocating engines thundering, the turbine whining and the propellers churning the ocean into a whitewash, Titanic would have been forging ahead, her machinery plant working like a beautiful, harmonic mechanical ecosystem. By the time the steam had finally passed through the turbine though, it had finally been exhausted of all of its use for the ship. Coming out of the turbines at a grand total of 1 pound per square inch, it needed to be disposed of. Here, 2 massive condenser units were put to work. These things were pear-shaped and worked in conjunction with a series of pumps and filters to essentially cool the steam back down and convert it again into water. This whole arrangement was extremely simple in its concept, but complicated in its operation. Tubes in the condenser circulated cold water, pumped from the ocean itself, or from Titanic's own bilge tanks. This water then cooled the steam and turned it back into water as well, 700,000 pounds per hour of the stuff, which would then drain thanks to huge pumps into tanks for recirculation through the system or for discharging over the side. The water was passed through filters which took out any impurities, like engineering grease, lubricants and that kind of thing, and then sent right back to the boilers to be turned into steam and sent around again. The water that had been drawn through the main condenser unit that was used to cool the steam was discharged out over the side of the ship in a large cascade through 2 outlets. You can actually see them in the photos of Titanic. It's like a constant stream of water as the ship's main condensers did their thing. On the night of the sinking, this presented a unique challenge. Exhaust condenser feed water, either from the engine's main condenser units described in this video, or from other smaller auxiliary condensers used to service steam-driven machines like pumps. It was all being vented out of the side of the ship right near the waterline. On the starboard side, Lifeboat 13's occupants were surprised to be lowered directly in line with a small waterfall of discharged condenser water. Not only did this almost flood their boat, but then it swept them away directly into the path of Lifeboat 15, which was almost lowered onto their heads. This video has outlined how Titanic's engines worked, but the truth is, it's just a light summary. This speaks nothing of the hundreds of pieces of auxiliary machinery and special devices needed to keep everything running. Pumps, water filters, electric motors and winches, evaporators, boilers, heaters, coolers, hydraulic machines, valves. It was a complicated mass of machinery that was, for its time, the most advanced system in the world. But today, all of it rests at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, much of it still in place on the ship. It's an eternal monument to the human minds that dreamt these machines up, the human hands that turned the plans into cold, hard reality, and the human lives spent and lost running them from Titanic's triumphant debut until her bitter end. Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel because we get new videos out weekly. If you want to support my work and get really cool perks like behind the scenes and early access, please visit my Patreon in the link in the description below, or sign up as a YouTube member. Come and join the crew. And as always, stay safe, stay happy, and I'll see you again next time.